This week on C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast, University of Utah Professor Eric Hinderaker examines Western land settlement before, during, and after the American Revolution. Using the Kentucky Territory as an example, he describes the conflicts and relationships between the new federal government, settlers, and Native Americans. And a note to our listeners, with the academic year now wrapped, Lectures in History will pause new episodes until September. Over the summer, we'll revisit some of our most compelling lectures and other history-focused programs. More in a moment.
Who first showed you democracy in action? A teacher, neighbor, community leader? Mine was my middle school social studies teacher, Mrs. Carlson. Honor that person and help power C-SPAN's America 250, an 18-month ad-free celebration of our nation's story. Give $25 or more by August 31st at cspan.org/donate to add your democracy hero to our online wall. We'll thank you with a Democracy Unfiltered decal. Your gift keeps these stories alive. Donate today at cspan.org/donate. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. We've been talking for the last couple of weeks in this class about the effects of the American Revolution and kind of framing that discussion around the question of how revolutionary was the American Revolution? What kinds of changes did it initiate in American society, American law, American government? Why should we think of the American Revolution as a revolution rather than simply a war for independence? And so we've talked about this in various frameworks. We talked about whether the revolution altered the social structure of the states that were involved in the revolution. And on the last time we met, we talked about the impact of the revolution on African Americans and on the institution of slavery. We saw that in that case, the legacy was quite mixed, right? The revolution set the institution of slavery on the path to destruction in the northern states, but was instrumental in kind of deepening and strengthening the institution in the southern states. Today I want to talk about two topics that are closely interrelated and that are really two sides of the same coin. I want to talk today about how the revolution affected Native Americans and how the revolution created a new system for thinking about making Western lands widely available to ordinary people. And those are two sides of the same coin. On the one hand, the revolution initiated a new kind of commitment to pretty rapid westward territorial expansion and a widely democratic system of land holding, land ownership, which was a really powerful engine of economic opportunity and democracy for a lot of ordinary white men and women and their families. But it also implied a pretty exploitative new approach to relations with Native Americans. And so, as I say, these are two sides of the same coin. And to begin kind of thinking about this just in the most abstract sense, there were people involved in the American Revolution, and foremost among them Thomas Jefferson, who thought a great deal about this problem, who believed that one of the most revolutionary aspects of the revolution ought to be making land more widely available to ordinary people on relatively easy terms. And this constituted a fundamental revolution in old European ways of thinking about the availability of land. Because in the old British system, in the old English system, land was a byproduct of aristocratic privilege. And landholding was something that flowed from the top of society downward. In England, the land was owned by a relatively small number of people who owned a lot of it. And they made it available on their own terms through rental agreements. If you think about the feudal system, this is a system where tenants farm the lands of great lords, and it's a system that really where land ownership and the power associated with it all resides at the top of society. And that principle was woven into the fabric of colonization, because if you think about the way lands became available in the colonies, the biggest colonies began with proprietary ownership. If you think about a colony like Pennsylvania, the first principle of Pennsylvania is the king gives all the land to William Penn and tells him he can do whatever he wants with it, right? And so this is a kind of an offshoot of that same aristocratic model where land starts at the top and is distributed downward according to whatever principles the powerful people who control it want to employ. And we talked last week about the fact that far from seeing that stuff die away, we talked about the idea of a feudal revival. There were a lot of absentee landowners that had control of a lot of land, and they were beginning to assert their privileges more strongly. They were collecting rents in a way that they couldn't in an earlier period. So this idea of land being tied to privilege, the privilege of a small number of powerful men, is just foundational, not only to English society, but to the way the colonies were organized. And for Jefferson, this was one of the most important things that needed to be overturned. We talked about his attack on primogeniture and entail, right? Trying to break up the great estates of the most powerful family. And this is kind of a parallel idea. One of Jefferson's cornerstone principles is the idea that the best social foundation for a republican government was to have a large number of yeoman farmers that owned relatively small, relatively similar amounts of land in fee simple, meaning they did not pay rent to great landlords. They held the land on their own terms. And so this idea of a society, a republic of yeoman farmers, was one of the foundational principles that many people, including especially Jefferson, wanted to work pretty hard to implement after the American Revolution. The problem is, of course, that making abundant amounts of land widely available on cheap terms means that you have to control that land in the first place. And this was not that simple because, of course, the lands that the United States aspired to control and redistribute were lands that were occupied by Native American populations with their own claims, with their own sense of legitimacy. And in the process of trying to enact this theoretical revolution in the availability of land, what we'll see is that the United States took a very exploitative approach to its relationship with Native peoples throughout Eastern North America. And that is a process that began in the Revolution itself. And in order to kind of focus our discussion of this issue, I want to focus on the Ohio country and the Ohio Indians. There were Indian populations all up and down the eastern seaboard in the kind of Trans-Appalachian West, and there are a lot of different stories associated with these groups. But for our purposes, just to kind of focus on one of these groups, I want to focus on the Ohio country, which we've already talked about because the Ohio Valley was the focus of Lord Dunmore's War in 1774. So we've already talked about European aspirations to control the Ohio country and Dunmore's effort to claim, basically to claim Kentucky, what is now Kentucky, from the Shawnees through his victory in Dunmore's War. The Ohio country population is kind of an interesting and complicated population because in the early 18th century, the Ohio Valley was largely depopulated for complicated historical reasons. And so in the decades before the American Revolution, the Ohio country was being repopulated by a pretty large and diverse group of Indians that were coming both from the east, from Pennsylvania and New Jersey and New York, and also coming from the north and the west. And so from the east, groups that were basically being displaced by the growth of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York were three populations in particular: the Delawares and Shawnees, who were migrating west out of Pennsylvania and New Jersey, and the Western Iroquois, so a group of Iroquois, so-called Mingos, is how they were the name that they were given in the Ohio country. And these groups were forming, in many cases, shared communities. The most important communities in the Ohio Valley were often multi-ethnic communities. And they were moving into the Ohio Valley both to move away from the immediate pressures of the growth of colonial settlement, and also because the Ohio Valley was a really good place to hunt and trade. Pennsylvania traders started traveling into the Ohio Valley, and so as these groups moved into the Ohio Valley, Pennsylvania traders followed them, and they had a pretty robust set of economic opportunities in the 1740s and 50s and 60s. So you have these groups moving in from the east, and at the same time, again, in response to the economic opportunity created by traders from Pennsylvania, a pretty wide array of groups from the north and west that were moving out of the French sphere and into the British sphere in the 1740s and 50s, including Wyandots, Chippewas, Odawas, Potawatomis, and others. Like I said, it was a relatively diverse population of native groups. And so the main thing I want you to understand is that when we talk about the Ohio Indians, we are talking about a diverse array of peoples that had not functioned together. They were not a coherent political unit. They had not operated together for a very long time at the time of the Revolution. And the Revolution forced them to make new kinds of collective choices in response to the pressures of that war. They had relied on a pattern of trade with Pennsylvania, an alliance both with Pennsylvania and really with each other for a number of years without really having further coalesced as any kind of a political unit. And then this was the group, of course, that was directly attacked by Virginia militia in Dunmore's War in 1774, particularly the Shawnees, who Dunmore thought was the most hostile of these groups, and the Shawnees were engaged in that war's one battle at Point Pleasant in 1774. And you remember that Dunmore's War established the principle, at least in the minds of Virginians, that Kentucky was now open to settlement. So one of the oddities of the American Revolution is that in the spring and summer of 1775, this is the same time that the shot heard around the world was fired at Lexington, or at Concord rather, the Battle of Lexington and Concord, the Battle of Bunker Hill. At the same time all that stuff was going on in New England, in central Kentucky, parties of Virginians were moving into this newly claimed land in the summer of 1775, and without permission from the crown, without any legitimate authority from above, but having participated in Dunmore's War in 1774, dozens, hundreds of people began to occupy central Kentucky in the spring and summer of 1775. This is a map that I just want to take a minute to look at, so I'm sure that you have a vision of what we're talking about when I talk about the Ohio country. And this is actually a map that depicts battles during and after the American Revolution. But when we talk about the Ohio country, I'm basically talking about this area mostly north of the Ohio River. Here's where the three rivers come together at Fort Pitt to define the headwaters of the Ohio. This is the Ohio country. And then Kentucky, the territory that people were beginning to occupy in 1775 and 1776 is down here. And you can see some of these early stations. Boonesboro is one of the early Kentucky stations, St. Asaph, Ruddles and Martin's stations. And this became kind of the leading edge of Anglo-American settlement even before there was an American Revolutionary War, right? So this is a process that's moving forward independent of the Revolution, and yet it intersects with the Revolution, and the Revolution fundamentally changes the fortunes of these people who are moving west, because under the auspices of the Crown, they were criminals, right? They were beyond the proclamation line of 1763. What they were doing was illegal. But under the, in the context of the American Revolution, as the Second Continental Congress was sitting, as revolutionary legislatures were taking over in the states, it was possible for them to make new claims to legitimacy. And that's exactly what these Kentucky settlers did. In the course of the American Revolution, these Kentucky settlers made common cause with the United States and with the revolutionary governments that managed them. And they made very specific pleas about the legitimacy of their occupation and settlement. They specifically talked about the fact that the king had restricted access to these western lands, but that they had fought and bled for these lands at the Battle of Point Pleasant. They had a legitimate and meaningful claim to these lands. And moreover, just as the United States seemed to be interested in liberty, they were also interested in liberty. And they really thought what the United States was talking about was pretty great, and they wanted to be a part of it. And they said the United States would be foolish to miss the opportunity to incorporate such skilled riflemen into their ranks. They petitioned Congress and said, if you support us out here, we will fight for you and we will keep the native peoples off of your backs. So they basically made the case that in addition to the fact that they adhered to the same principles of liberty that the United States did, they also made a strategic argument that they could be very useful allies. And that was an argument that got traction. It got traction with the new revolutionary state of Virginia, which began arming and supporting their little forts. The communities that were settled in central Kentucky all took a form something like this, where cabins were built in a circle with palisades so that the community became a kind of a makeshift fort. Because these guys recognized from the beginning that they were operating in territory where they would be regarded as hostile invaders, and it was incumbent upon them to defend themselves against both Native Americans that might not want them there, and also as the war progressed against the pressures of British arms as well. One of the key people involved in this process, let me ask you this. So when you think of Daniel Boone, do you think of the American Revolution? Do you think of him as a figure of the American Revolution? He's familiar, right? Daniel Boone is familiar. Everybody knows who Daniel Boone was. He's a great, American frontiersman, right? Think of him kind of in the era of Davy Crockett. But it's weird because Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett are generations apart, right? Davy Crockett was at the Alamo. Can anybody place this date in time? When was the Battle of the Alamo?
1840s.
1840s? We're talking about 1775. This is when Daniel Boone's single most famous act of pioneering took place. He led a party of settlers in the wake of Dunmore's War through the Cumberland Gap and into central Kentucky. And one of the first towns founded in central Kentucky was Boonesboro. It was founded in 1775. So it's weird to think of Daniel Boone as a Revolutionary War hero, right? His most famous act occurred before the United States even existed. And it's fascinating that we don't, in the popular imagination, we don't place him in time here because we don't think of the American Revolution as a pioneering era. But the American Revolution is the first pioneering era and the first, intrepid Western explorers / occupiers, swung into action in the Revolution and in Kentucky. Now, I want to say a little bit more about Daniel Boone in just a minute, but hold that thought. And just to kind of talk quickly about the war experience in central Kentucky. The various communities of central Kentucky petitioned both the Virginia legislature and the Continental Congress for support, and they received that support. The Virginia House of Delegates, first of all, extended its jurisdiction across all of what is now Kentucky. It created a great big new western county so that those new communities in central Kentucky would have a kind of a framework for government. And it started sending regular supplies of powder and lead so that these settlements could defend themselves. And the Continental Congress also responded favorably to these petitions, and beginning in July of 1776, the Continental Congress manned and supplied 3 new forts on the Ohio River that were designed basically to protect and support these new Kentucky settlements.
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
During the fall and winter of 1776, it sent 2 tons of powder, 4 tons of lead, boats to carry 1,500 men, and food to support 2,000 people for 6 months. I mean, that's a fair amount of war material that the Continental Congress was providing to Kentucky at a very early stage. And then when conditions deteriorated in the following spring, Congress sent 1,000 rifles and another ton of lead. So, from the beginning of the war effort, these small embattled Kentucky communities were fortunate to receive the support of revolutionary governments, both at the state level and at the national level. The Ohio Indians, meanwhile, were in a difficult position. They were somewhat divided in terms of their sense of loyalties. The article that I asked you to read for today talks a little bit about the Ohio Indians and their decisions, their loyalties. The Ohio Indians had a fairly long connection by 1776 to the British Empire, but they had also had a fairly long connection to the Pennsylvania traders. And so they had pre-existing relationships with both the British and the Americans that could have led them in either direction. Initially, both governments hoped that they would remain neutral, and U.S. leaders pleaded with them to just stay out of the revolution, told them it was just an internal spat between the colonies and the English, and they didn't have to have anything to do with it. But it became clear really quickly that in fact the United States was putting a lot of new pressure on their territory. And so gradually, by about 1777, a large coalition of Ohio Indians had decided that their interests lay with the British Empire, with the efforts of the British to defeat the Americans, and they began fighting against the Kentucky settlements with British support. And so from 1777 on, most of the Ohio Indians found themselves aligned with the British, even though from that article we read a little earlier in the semester about White Eyes and the Delawares. There was an earlier period where White Eyes and a large faction of Delawares thought that maybe their best bet was to ally themselves with the United States. The Kentucky settlements really kind of helped change that dynamic for them. The war ended in 1783. The fighting ended in 1781, but the war was formally concluded in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris. And one of the well-known facts about this treaty is that in this document that defined the peace between Great Britain and the United States, no mention was made of Britain's Native American allies. The native population of North America is simply not a subject of the Treaty of Paris of 1783, and this meant that the United States could interpret the significance of this treaty for Native peoples any way that it wanted to. And the United States chose to interpret the Treaty of Paris, where Britain basically says, we lost the war. The United States interpreted this treaty to extend to Britain's Native allies, and in fact to all the Native peoples in the Near East, whether they were allied with Great Britain, whether they were neutral, or whether they were allied with the United States. In the case of the Oneida Indians, for example, it didn't help them at all in the post-war period that they had been an ally of the U.S. during the war. And so the logic of victory in the Revolution for the United States meant that not only had Great Britain been defeated, but all of the native peoples of the Near Eastern region, the Trans-Appalachian West, had also, in effect, been defeated by extension. The Ohio Indians did not accept this premise. In fact, the Ohio Indians had never been defeated themselves in the course of the American Revolution. They were still in a pretty strong position in 1783. Kentucky was still, it was starting to grow a lot faster, but it was still embattled. And they simply did not accept the logic that the U.S. applied to the Treaty of Paris. And so at the end of the war, everything was unclear in terms of relations between the U.S. and the Ohio Indians. And in this sense, it was a similar situation, the U.S. relation with Indian groups throughout the Trans-Appalachian West. I want to just pause at this point and talk a little bit about Daniel Boone, because his placing him in Kentucky in 1775 is a little bit surprising. If you don't know a lot about him, if you haven't thought very much about Daniel Boone, I want to talk for a minute about how Daniel Boone first became famous, because he became a famous figure right after the Revolutionary War. He became famous as a result of the publication of this text, John Filson's Discovery and Settlement of Kentucky. John Filson was a land speculator and promoter who was interested in encouraging the rapid occupation of Kentucky. And in the year after the signing of the Treaty of Paris, he published this book on the discovery and settlement of Kentucky, which is kind of interesting. It narrates the story of the occupation of Kentucky and its experiences in the Revolution, and it includes an appendix entitled The Adventures of Colonel Daniel Boone, containing a narrative of the wars of Kentucky. And it included this little biographical appendix included this illustration that shows Daniel Boone with his rifle and his hunting dog, the earliest depiction of Boone. And the purpose of the purpose of the pamphlet was to promote settlement in Kentucky, and the purpose of the appendix that talked about Daniel Boone was both to describe his heroism and the kind of harrowing experiences of the war, and also to stress that those harrowing experiences were now over. And so Boone became this kind of, he became the first American pioneer hero. And his fame took off rather quickly. He became famous even in his own lifetime. This is the first portrait painted of Boone. This was painted late in his life by a man named Chester Harding. It's a well-known image of Boone later in life. There's another early unattributed painting depicting him. It's interesting to look at the clothing in these three portraits. What strikes you about this one? What do you see? What is he wearing? Yeah, Ian.
He's wearing a lot of furs, implying that he has spent time in the West, sort of in the fur trading areas rather than just being settled in the East. He's wearing a lot of leather. He's carrying a rifle. He looks like he's armed to go out and take on the frontier rather than in the portrait where he looks like he's much more of a gentleman, a scholar type individual. Yeah,
you see the fur trim in this suit of clothes. You can also see that the leather leggings and the coat is kind of stitched together. This is obviously not factory-made clothing. You can also see his trademark coonskin cap, apparently already in his hand, as well as the hunting equipment. He's got a powder horn around his shoulder and a rifle. This portrait does seem, as Ian just said, to depict him more as a kind of, urbane gentleman. Of course, this is a later period, and this is not fancy clothing, but he does seem to be wearing, an ordinary suit of clothes with a white collared shirt. This depiction begins to, I think, take on some of the familiar trappings of Daniel Boone as a kind of a mythic figure in American culture, where the collared shirt and wool jacket that we saw in the previous portrait has been replaced by a fringed buckskin jacket, and it's unclear what kind of shirt he's wearing, but it's not a fancy one. The most famous depiction of Daniel Boone of the 19th century is this painting that was done by George Caleb Bingham in the 1850s. Bingham is one of the great genre painters of the 19th century. Really, if you're not familiar with his work, I recommend checking it out. He did a lot of really interesting stuff. This is one of his most famous paintings, Daniel Boone escorting settlers through the Cumberland Gap. So in 1851, 1852, he's depicting something that occurred, 4 generations earlier, right? This is a much later painting. What strikes you about this depiction of Daniel Boone and of the party that he was leading? What do you see here?
I think it's interesting that it's choosing to portray the party as sort of coming out of the shadows and into the light. Like it's sort of the light of entering a new land, but in the end it was still more of a new, unexplored, they need to fend for themselves. It's very much depicted as sort of the beginning of an era, I suppose, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah, that's really well said. I mean, it definitely is, you have the sense of coming out of darkness into light, and to think of that as historical as well as geographical, I think is really useful. This is a dangerous wilderness that these people are traversing, right? You can see by the blasted tree, by the threatening weather, by the craggy rocks, right? And also just by how dark everything is. You see the swordsman, in the background. I think that's a sword, presumably fending off enemies, hostiles, probably hostile native peoples. In fact, Boone's party was attacked by native warriors. What else? Matt?
The woman on the horse is kind of reminiscent of the Virgin Mary, it seems, maybe, which would suggest maybe that divine providence is smiling down on this act.
Yeah, exactly. Her, this female figure is clearly echoing, traditional artistic depictions of Mary, the Virgin Mary, and so there is, yes, the idea of divine providence at work in this emigration, I think, for sure.
I had a very different interpretation of that guy in the back when I first looked at this. Due to his elevated status, it strikes me that he's got a crop.
It could be a crop, yeah.
And striking an ox or
he could be driving livestock forward. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I'm not sure which it is.
We'll never know.
Yeah, Chris.
To tie their two comments together, there's the great song, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil." And they're coming through this shadowy valley, walking out, and they're confident. And as you noted, the divine providence, and they're coming into the light. They're walking out of that valley.
Yeah. It does make you think of the 23rd Psalm. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil. What about Boone? We haven't said anything about... Sorry, Emma, do you want to...
No, I was just going to say, it's interesting to see how you can clearly see the perspective of the artist in this, and how it kind of seems like this party's like the saving grace. They're going to come and save Kentucky and make it so much better. They don't seem to be struggling, even though there is all the wood around them, and like we pointed out, how wilderness it was. It just seems like, oh, we're gonna come and do this, no problem. We're just that good.
Yeah, Yeah, it's a good point. They're surrounded by dangers, but they seem to be apart from the dangers. Yeah, and bringing a new kind of civilized existence into the wilderness. What about Daniel Boone himself? What do you note? What would you say about the way that he is depicted?
Seems depicted as a very plain and ordinary man.
Plain and ordinary, yeah.
It seems like my interpretation of that is that he's trying to lead regular, normal American people into the West, and that it's a place for the people of the United States to go west into, to head into this brave new world, and that any man can do it. It's not just, some military officer or some wealthy person who's paying for this expedition. It's a normal man who's taking them in and exploring into this new world.
Yeah. That's interesting. I like that emphasis on the ordinariness of this party. I also think it's interesting. Like, he seems to be wearing, kind of like the leather suit that it's appropriate to picture him in, and yet Bingham has kind of transformed it into a very respectable looking kind of. He looks like almost like a middle class gentleman, and particularly I think by giving him a different kind of hat. There's a way that he's kind of been dressed up from those earlier depictions. Anyway, this is a very I think an interesting and important painting, and one that really captures the sensibilities in mid-19th century America about the whole westering enterprise, the whole idea that American westward expansion is about bringing civilization to a howling wilderness. This is another painting that I could not find an inscription for, but I think this is a really interesting variation on the Bingham depiction. And I think it's kind of characteristic of mid to late 20th century values associated with the same process. What strikes you here in contrast? Like, how would you say this painting differs from Bingham's painting in depicting the enterprise of westward expansion?
In the first picture, the light was really just shining on Boone. And here the light is on everybody. And you can see it all the way across. It's not just the guy in front.
Yeah, the light is on everybody, so it's a more kind of democratic depiction of the group itself. What about the natural setting?
It's a lot softer. It looks like their way has been being lit through that light flowing through these trees, and looks a lot easier for them than it did in the first painting.
Yeah, it's softer, it looks easier. It's a cathedral of nature, right? It's not a howling wilderness. And that seems to me to capture a lot about the difference between 19th century sensibilities about the westward enterprise and 20th century sensibilities about the sort of the benign glories of nature. There are no benign glories in the Bingham painting. It's interesting to think about why Boone is misplaced in our imaginations, why we tend to confuse him with the sort of Davy Crockett era. I do have one theory, and this might not relate at all to your generation, but it relates to mine. When I was a kid, I think I confused Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett because Fess Parker played them both in Walt Disney TV shows, and he wore, if I'm not mistaken, almost exactly the same costume for both roles. So that's what I blame my confusion on. But I do think more fundamentally, we don't really think of the era of the Revolution as being also an era of westward expansion, but it really is. And in fact, in the experience of those early Kentucky settlements, the American Revolution legitimizes westward expansion, a kind of an unbridled form of westward expansion for the first time in American history.
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
This is the map that was printed in that John Filson, that 1784 book about the discovery and settlement of Kentucky. What strikes you about this image? If you were, I don't know, renting land in New Jersey and contemplating the possibility of moving to Kentucky, what would this image tell you about what you could expect in Kentucky? Yeah, Tara.
It's empty. There's nobody there. There's no divisions of like Native American lines or anything. It's just open land.
It looks like open land. If you look carefully, you'll see some of those early settlements, but there's a lot of open space. Yeah, what else? Ian.
It seems to me like there's a lot of detail on the river networks, but there's not a lot of detail on a whole lot else, which to me would tell me that they don't really know what's out there. The government owns the land, and controls the land, but they don't know what's out there any more than anybody else does. So I have no idea what I'm getting into if I actually buy land out there.
Yeah, it's true. There are not a lot of political demarcations. But I think the point that you started with is the point that I would emphasize most, which is if you are a farmer, what you want is well-watered, fertile land. And this is a picture of what appears to be extraordinarily well-watered, fertile land. In fact, it is well-watered. If you know the Kentucky bluegrass, I mean, this is a great place to be a farmer. And Filson is basically, in this pamphlet, and especially in this map, throwing the doors of people's imaginations open to the possibility of settling in Kentucky. So it's an interesting question. A, did it work? And B, if you chose to follow Filson's advice and move there, what would your experience be? And the answer is, man, it was complicated. People who took up land in early Kentucky stumbled into a kind of nightmarish set of problems associated with land distribution. And the problems are really embodied in the Virginia Land Ordinance of 1779. Remember, I said that Virginia extended its jurisdiction over all of Kentucky. It created a big new western county. And so in 1779, the Virginia House of Delegates passed a law that set out the terms by which people could claim land in this new western county. And it was really complicated. The first thing about the Virginia Land Ordinance of 1779 is it gave priority to settlers rather than speculators. And so in this, you can see a kind of revolutionary impulse to make sure that, some rich guy who never goes out there doesn't get control of all the land. It gave priority to people who had actually settled the land, but it created a bewildering and expensive process that they had to follow in order to actually gain title. And so the process was multi-stage. The first thing you had to do, you had to go to Kentucky in order to have a legitimate claim, right? Because it gave priority to settlers. But then, once you had gone to Kentucky, and then the next thing you have to do is go back to Richmond in order to pay the fees that would allow you to claim the lands that you had already visited. So you would go to the treasurer's office in Richmond to pay a patent fee, get a treasurer's receipt, then to the auditor's office. That's where you would get the treasurer's receipt. Then you would go to the land office, where the receipt and certificate entitled you to a land warrant. And then, with a land warrant in hand, you could return to Kentucky. And in Kentucky, register with the county surveyor and have the land surveyed. So you go, first of all, to Kentucky. to find out where you want to be in the first place. Then you go back, you go through this elaborate series of steps in Richmond to get all the legal paper that you need to go back to Kentucky, and then you've got to hire a surveyor to do a survey. And this is, a lot of people are doing this at the same time, and there is no system in place in Kentucky to make sure that any of this occurs in a kind of an orderly way. Then the surveyor issues you a plat and certificate along with an endorsed warrant, and then you would go back to Richmond to receive a land title. This is impossible. Nobody can do this right. So what happened in the course of the Revolution, and especially after the Revolution very quickly, is that lots of people went to Kentucky and chaos ensued. The population of Kentucky rose very slowly as long as there was active fighting going on, and it kind of ebbed and flowed during the war years. But in 1783, there were 12,000 people in Kentucky. 1783, the date of the Treaty of Paris. After that point, it rose really fast. By 1790, there were 100,000 people in Kentucky. By 1800, 220,000 people, 40,000 of them enslaved. So this is obviously a very rapid pattern of population growth. If you look at what resulted from all of these people going to a place that had a bad land distribution system, the early history of Kentucky as a state features legal documents with a lot of pictures like this. This is a plat that was made by Hancock Taylor of Mildred Lightfoot's claim, and I'm not even sure which one of these Mildred Lightfoot's is, near the Falls of the Ohio, near what's now Louisville, Kentucky, that shows all of the other claims that overlapped and competed with hers. The early history of Kentucky is a history of nonstop litigation over survey problems like this. But it's, this kind of problem is woven into the structure of that land distribution, that land ordinance of 1779, right? Which, the Kentucky legislature thought, the Virginia legislature thought they were creating a system that would be fair and democratic, right? Because you had to do all this stuff in the right order and you have to do it the right way. But nobody can actually do what the statute describes effectively, or many people can't. And so what you get is chaos on the ground. So it's with this in mind that people like Thomas Jefferson in the 1780s were rethinking in fundamental ways the problem of land distribution. And this is a process, a reconceptualization process that culminated in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. For today, I asked you to read actually not about the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, but about the Land Ordinance of 1784. In the Jefferson Papers, the editors of the Jefferson Papers have a really good essay on the kind of evolution of thinking about Western lands that I asked you to take a look at. So there are a lot of details in the Land Ordinance of 1784, and then that got modified for the Land Ordinance of 1787. But what, in your reading of that essay in the Jefferson Papers, what particularly struck you as the kind of main takeaway points that the editors emphasize in describing this process of developing a land system? Do you remember any key points, particularly focusing on Jefferson and on his evolving thought about the Trans-Appalachian West, that part of the of U.S. territory beyond the bounds of the existing states?
I think the editors might have diluted what Jefferson was trying to get across. I think Jefferson was really radical in thinking that they should really close off these lands and kind of just settle them and get it over with. And the editors really wanted it to but really wanted to look at the land as like extra resource that the colonies had, and to not just like put it off and say that we can't keep expanding.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, so you think that that essay kind of dilutes the radicalism of Jefferson's intention. Yeah, I mean, and you can see Jefferson's thought itself evolving. I mean, initially they talk about, you know, the fact that he's considering, you know, one or a couple of Western states, and eventually, you know, this evolves into, this is a map. There is no map in Jefferson's hands of his intention, but there is a surviving map, the so-called Jefferson-Hartley map that essay talks about from 1784. And you know, one of the things that Jefferson had in mind, and lots of people had in mind, Thomas Paine actually wrote a pamphlet about the importance of this, is that all of the colonies that had, you know, claims to Western lands that extended far into the interior, because a lot of the early colonies had sea-to-sea charters. So, you know, Virginia was advantaged in this, New York. Certain colonies were advantaged in this. And the first thing that Jefferson and others believed that it was important to do is to have all of the individual states cede their Western land claims to the United States, so the United States could collectively deal with all of them together. And so you can see that Jefferson has imagined Western boundaries, including a pretty aggressive Western boundary for the state of Pennsylvania, to open up these lands to new settlements. And then you can see by 1784, Jefferson is imagining the possibility of 14 different new Western states, right? And both the Land Ordinance of 1784 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, they're very conscious of the kinds of problems that Virginia Land Ordinance of 1779 created, and they want to have a system of that will allow for rapid westward expansion in a more orderly way. So uniform surveys and public sales are principles that are kind of woven into these early ordinances. And then the thing that is most famous, most noteworthy, and also kind of, I think, most easily overlooked by Americans, by us, because we take it for granted, the territorial system. So what do I mean by this phrase, the territorial system? What is the territorial system?
Isn't it like areas with less than a certain population cannot yet be incorporated as states until they reach a certain number? Like technically, there's some states in the U.S. today that wouldn't have even reached that number. I think Kentucky's one of them.
No, that's not.
No?
Kentucky's big enough to be a state. But yes, that's right. You can't become a state until you reach a certain population. So it creates a territorial status, and then, which is to say that it's an area that's governed by the federal government but does not yet have state status. But then when, you know, in the Northwest Ordinances, it ultimately states when 60,000 people reside in the territory, then they can, you know, gather together and apply for statehood status. This is so unusual. And it's really contrary to the, like, for example, the British model of colonization. Because Great Britain creates the colony of, you know, name your colony, Virginia. But there's never a time when Virginia is going to become part of Great Britain, right? It's permanently a colony. This is a crazy idea to envision, for a nation made up of states, to envision this kind of elastic western boundary, elastic number of states. Jefferson here has drawn a map in which new, not yet existing states outnumber the original 13 states of the United States. What nation would do this to itself? It's a very strange idea, right? It is a very strange idea to have woven into the fabric of the Constitution a system that allows for the indefinite expansion of the nation through space and through the accretion of additional political units that have the power over time to overwhelm the original, the political units, the states that originally made up the country.
I just have a question about the expansion part. What did France or Spain or Great Britain think of this map? Because this very clearly incorporates territories that they supposedly claimed and had claim to in the Northwest or in the Southwest down there.
Well, that's right. And it became, the United States had to worry a lot about the hostility of foreign powers in the early decades of its existence. And even in territories that had been ceded to the United States by Great Britain by the terms of the Treaty of Paris of 1783, Britain continued it never gave up its western posts in the Great Lakes region, and it continued to harass or encourage native allies to harass settlement. The War of 1812, is a kind of a British assault on American sovereignty on multiple fronts at once. And similarly in the southeast, Spain in particular, challenged American sovereignty over the American southeast, and Aaron Burr and various other people, considered conspiring. Actually, a lot of people who settled in Kentucky and Tennessee spent some time, people like John Sevier in Kentucky spent some time thinking about whether an alliance with Spain would serve them better than an alliance with the United States. So the United States had a real problem. This map is envisioning a system that will encourage the rapid occupation and settlement of a gigantic new territory of land. But as people, take up the challenge or take up the promise of that possibility, there is very good possibility that the United States would not be the kind of superintending power that would best serve their interests. And there's a period in the early Republic when a lot of people in the Southwest were more interested in, or as interested in, Spain as a possible ally as they were in the United States. Yeah.
Wasn't the Oregon Territory, I may be overstepping the bounds of this class a little bit, but wasn't the Oregon Territory split between Britain and the United States for a good long time?
Right. Yeah. The Oregon country was split, and there was, it's not resolved until it's not clear until the 1840s that boundary would be resolved without a fight. But originally, the dividing line between U.S. and British claims in Oregon was fuzzy, just because the Treaty of Paris didn't really draw the line that far out. Well, this territorial system, I want to just stress, this is a very radical system. This is a radical thing. There is no real clear precedent for a nation inventing a system for occupying new territory in this way. And the idea that new states would be admitted on an equal footing with old states, I think, is particularly striking. Ultimately, what you see in these provisions is the creation of an elastic nation. Here is a map that shows the Northwest Territory as it's ultimately created in 1787. This is a map that stands in 1787. 1787 was an act of the Second Continental Congress. This is before the Constitution had even been drafted. So this is at a point where the United States is still, kind of an infant, ill-defined nation, and yet this map stands as an open invitation to people who are interested in westward expansion, in moving onto new lands on easy terms. It's kind of an open invitation to think that the United States is somehow going to oversee and guarantee that process. The idea of a kind of uniform public system of land distribution was partly was partly undermined by a more complicated set of arrangements in the Revolutionary period, because, in a kind of an ideal sense, Jefferson thought it would be great to have this sort of blank slate where you could ensure some kind of open public access. But in fact, Congress had all kinds of reasons to favor and support other kinds of purchases, particularly because Congress needed money and was always willing to take shortcuts with Western lands. And so at the same time that it was, inventing the territorial system, it was also proceeding with other kinds of private sales. For example, in 1787, it sold 5 million acres of land to the Ohio Company of New England. This was a company that was made up of former officers of the Continental Army, and this 5 million acres became the original core, the core settlements of the new state of Ohio. That group subcontracted a sale of about 1 million acres to a second company, the Scioto Company. Congress sold over 300,000 acres to a guy named John Cleave Sims in 1788. And at the same time, Connecticut was claiming lands that resulted in a so-called Western Reserve of 3.36 million acres. So the point of this is to say that even at the same time that Congress was trying to map out this uniform system, it was also sowing confusion in various ways by allowing other groups to purchase or claim lands on their own terms. And then there was the problem of officers' warrants from the Revolution, which also gave Continental Army officers a claim to Western lands, and state officers as well. So that results in the creation of the Virginia Military District of 4.2 million acres and the U.S. Military District of 2.5 million acres. So it's interesting because we think about that Northwest Ordinance as being a very kind of clear and clean set of provisions about how Western lands are going to be occupied, but at the very same time that Congress is formulating that policy, it is also hastily disposing of gigantic parcels on different terms in the West. And so in the fall of 1787, Congress also auctioned off 73,000 acres in the first federal range under the terms of the Northwest Ordinance. And so all of this stuff is going forward together at the same time, resulting in a map of, Ohio did not yet exist at this point, but this is a map of the modern state of Ohio that shows all of these things laid out in relation to each other. The Ohio Company purchase, the U.S. and Virginia military districts, the Sims purchase, the Connecticut Western Reserve, and the 7 ranges that were being surveyed under the terms of the Northwest Ordinance. This is a kind of really complicated and chaotic system. And, by the way, every inch of that ground was claimed by some combination of native peoples who still had a legitimate claim to control that land. So what this meant, because the United States was so enthusiastic about Western lands, it was proceeding on all of these fronts at once, and because it desperately needed the money that Western land could produce, this meant that it had to deal very hastily and expeditiously with a very large and complex native population that occupied the Ohio country. And as I said, believed that they had won whatever battles were fought in the course of the American Revolution. So the United States implemented a series of what can only be described as sham treaties. We often say, like, Indians were cheated in the treaty-making process. I mean, the truth is that different treaties have different stories, and some of them were very, very legitimate enterprises. But this was a series of sham treaties where, in most cases, the United States did not have legitimate representatives of the Indian nations that they were trying to deal with. There was liquor involved. There was coercion involved. The first of those treaties was the Treaty of Fort Stanwix in 1784, right after the Treaty of Paris. Representatives of the Continental Congress raced off to upstate New York, trying to get there before New York's own representatives could get there, to deal with the Iroquois Confederacy. And the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, this is one of the treaties in which the Native representatives present explicitly said that they did not have the authority to sign any binding document. But the United States presented them with the doctrine that they had been defeated as a result of the British defeat, and insisted that they cede all of their claims to lands in the Ohio country. And they got a document that was signed, though it was contested by the Iroquois from the very beginning. Something very similar happened at the Treaty of Fort McIntosh in 1785, dealing with the Delawares, and at the Treaty of Fort Finney in 1786, dealing with the Shawnees. Ultimately, Congress came to recognize that these treaties were all so problematic that they tried to organize a single treaty meeting at Fort Harmar in 1789 that would bring together representatives of all of the Ohio Indians in one mass gathering. Again, the United States walked away with a signed document, but from the perspective of the Native Americans who attended, it was completely chaotic and indeterminative, and again, they contested the outcome. So in that context, with those treaties, those failed treaties in the background, from 1787 until 1794, the United States was back at war with the Ohio Indians. And this was a war that really was the first military undertaking of the new United States Army. The first function of the U.S. Army was to try to defeat this coalition of Ohio Indians, which the United States had failed to bargain with in the form of treaties, and which the United States really needed to get out of the way if it was going to proceed with its Western land enterprise. Arthur St. Clair was the first commander of American forces in the Ohio country. He did not do very well. In 1789 and 1791, he suffered major defeats. He was succeeded in his command by Anthony Wayne, so-called Mad Anthony Wayne, who had more success, and finally defeated in a decisive fashion the Ohio Coalition at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794. After that battle, the Ohio Indians signed the Treaty of Greenville to bring an end to the conflict and agreed to sign away some of their lands. And so the Treaty of Greenville is the first treaty in the Ohio country that was the product not of negotiation but of warfare. And the Ohio Coalition agreed to sign away a big chunk of the modern state of Ohio and also part of Indiana. So you can see that the result of this warfare was to basically allow the United States to claim control of most of the territories that we just talked about that they had in effect already arranged for the sale and settlement of. This pattern of really rapid westward expansion without regard for native territorial claims and in a process that really accelerated violence between the United States and Native Americans and the kind of rapid dispossession of native lands. This series of experiences in the 1780s and 1790s really, in many ways, sets a pattern that the United States follows for a really long period of time to come, right? Because the U.S. Very soon comes to believe not only that it would be really great to settle everything east of the Mississippi, but that in fact that this was a nation with a continental destiny, right? A manifest destiny to spread the continent. And that was a doctrine, that doctrine of manifest destiny, that bore very hard on the interests of Native peoples throughout North America.
Did the U.S. look at this as like an effective way of dealing with the Native Americans?
Or
Because they continued to do it to like up to the industrial revolution, right?
yeah, I mean, it's a good question. The U.S. think of this as an effective way to deal with Native Americans. I think increasingly the U.S. came to think of this as the only way to deal with Native Americans, because of the fact that the U.S. was invested in such a rapid form of territorial expansion that it could not really take Native claims to territory seriously. And the flip side of this story is the story of, not only warfare against Indians and not only sham treaties, but also the fact that the United States chose to perpetuate European doctrines about the idea that Native Americans did not really own the land, that European claims superseded Native American claims, right? That's the famous discovery doctrine, right? So European crowns, from the 16th century forward would say, that, for example, you could divide up North America among France and Britain and Spain based on who discovered what. And the presence of Native Americans was only incidental. It would have been possible for the United States in the era of all men are created equal to say, you know what, that discovery doctrine is pretty problematic. And we really ought to think about putting the claims of people who are already on the ground on a different footing and treating them more fairly, right, more respectfully. But that's not the doctrine that evolved in the United States. Instead, the doctrine that evolved in the United States, the Marshall Court in the 1820s and 30s explicitly says, in a couple of important treaty documents, explicitly says that European doctrine of discovery remains in force. And it's funny because Marshall is sometimes almost sounds bemused by this doctrine. But he says this is the way that it's always been done, and this is the way we're still doing it. The two famous cases, which still get cited all the time in this context, are Johnson v. McIntosh, which involved land sales by Piankashaw Indians, which was decided in 1823. And here, for the first time, Chief Justice John Marshall explicitly says the discovery doctrine that European crowns used in earlier centuries is still the doctrine that holds today. And he described the Piankashaws in this opinion as perpetual inhabitants with diminutive rights, and then goes on to justify that description by saying that they were an inferior race of people without the privileges of citizens and under the perpetual protection and pupillage of the government. Right? So in order to justify the perpetuation of this discovery doctrine, he also needs to characterize them as racially distinct and inferior in American law. And the same kind of idea is further articulated in the famous Cherokee Nation v. Georgia case in 1831, where Marshall coined the phrase domestic dependent nations to describe the legal status of Indians, which is a weird phrase, domestic dependent. It's unclear how you can be a nation, but also dependent, because nation implies sovereignty, but domestic and dependent imply no sovereignty. And in fact, the kind of contradiction inherent in that phrase is really at the heart of the legal status of the modern reservation system that continues to govern the relationship between Indian tribes and the United States. So, it's an interesting. So when we step back from this and think about, return to the question of what did the American Revolution mean for Native Americans? Was the American Revolution revolutionary for Native Americans? No, not really. I mean, in doctrinal terms, it was the opposite. It explicitly perpetuated a doctrine that regarded them as, less than legitimate claimants to territory. It was revolutionary only in the sense that it put into place a set of mechanisms for national expansion that dramatically accelerated the means by which they could be dispossessed through violence, through treaty making, through a kind of inexorable territorial expansion that had a logic of its own that ignored the legitimacy of native claims. Any questions, thoughts before we finish for today?
I just had a thought on like domestic dependent nations. We talked about this a lot in one of my classes in high school about how colonists would like arm the natives with weaponry, and they would like learn to hunt with rifles, and through this use of like learning to hunt with rifles, they would depend on the colonists for ammunition and for gunpowder, and I think it just describes domestic dependent nations very well.
Yeah, that idea of dependency that has to do with the idea that native communities came to rely on like European manufacturers is a concept that anthropologists and historians have developed. I think that in this case, he means what Marshall meant by dependent was not dependent on European manufacturers. I think what he means here is dependent on American law. That is to say, they're not independent. They can't run their own affairs. They're dependent in the sense that ultimately what the United States says goes, right? So if you think about the reservation system, it's still true, right? They have certain limited autonomy within the system, but they are dependent on the United States, and they cannot act independently as nations. And that idea of domestic dependent nations is it's still the way Native American tribes, that's the official federal term, that's still the way that Native American tribes operate in relation to the United States. All right, I think that's everything for today. I will see you on Wednesday, and we will talk about virtue, gender, and citizenship.
Thanks for listening to this week's Lectures in History podcast. To find more of our history programming, visit our website at c-span.org.